No os esperéis tanto, ¿eh? Muchas gracias, Joan, por esta presentación y buenos días. Quería agradecer a los organizadores la amable invitación. Es para mí un placer estar aquí tratando este tema que creo que es fascinante, y este tema me refiero a Internet. Y en fin, Barcelona es mi segunda casa, la mitad de mi familia es catalana, pero me temo que yo voy a hacer la presentación ni siquiera en castellano, pero en inglés, y la propera vegada en catalán. Y también me temo que no voy a hablar tanto de revolución como de regulación. Y después de haber tenido una presentación tan extremadamente brillante, pues el desafío es doble, ¿no? So now in English. When I was preparing my intervention, ahead of this conference, and I looked at the title in the program, which said the regulation of audiovisual content in the era of digital convergence, it took me a while to decide what to talk about. First of all, because I think I still don't know what convergence means, but I would leave that for the discussion afterwards. And one option as a traditional regulator would have been to focus on the micro details of traditional content regulation and how this might change in a multi-channel and multi-platform environment. Considering, for example, the no doubt thrilling question of the number of minutes that channels are allowed to advertise, or the no less interesting matter of the use of offensive language or wardrobe malfunctions in peak time. Or even better, the everlasting drama of the future of public service broadcasting. These have been, up until today, the matters that have occupied and preoccupied content regulators and policymakers for the last 20 years in Europe and elsewhere. And these would also be the matters that content regulators such as Ofcom are most familiar with. I doubt, however, that the organizers had in mind this when they asked me to come to a forum which main theme is the Internet and the participatory Web 2.0, which is very much new media as opposed to the old media that perhaps I represent. So my first thought was that some of you could be wondering what can a regulator such as Ofcom have to say about this topic. And Joan has tried to justify, I think, the presence of Ofcom here. And I would like to do that a little bit more as well. I think what does a regulator such as Ofcom have to say about the Internet is a fair question to ask. The most common challenges associated with Internet today relate to things such as the protection of privacy, the fight against cybercrime, copyright, and issues of fair use. And none of these are matters that Ofcom has any responsibility for whatsoever. And similarly, although Ofcom does regulate the provision of Internet access and services such as voice over IP, the UK Parliament took a very deliberate decision in 2003 to exclude from Ofcom's remit the regulation of Internet content and also, in particular, the regulation of video-on-demand services. The reason for this, which in my opinion was the right reason, was not so much the idea, or rather the myth, that you can't regulate the Internet, because you can, but instead the view that the application of additional, to the general law, additional sector-specific rules, for example, broadcasting rules, which were designed in a particular historical and technological context, was not only disproportionate when balanced, for example, against the fundamental right of freedom of expression, but also impractical and likely to fail. At the moment, the debate is up again, and those sound and good arguments might have to be reminded in a number of occasions. But the world has also changed a little bit. And this notwithstanding, Ofcom did receive a statutory duty to promote what in the Anglo-Saxon world is known as media literacy, which has been translated, I think, in Spanish as alfabetización digital, and which refers to the ability to access, understand, and create media in a variety of contexts. This was at the time quite a novelty for a regulator, quite revolutionary to a limited extent, and it has been progressively embraced by other regulators and institutions like the European Commission itself. In addition, and despite having fairly limited responsibilities with respect to the Internet, A number of developments, recent developments over the last couple of years have forced Ofcom and other regulators to think what, if any, and let me emphasize, if any, role should we play in the control of the delivery of content over the internet. These developments are varied. They include, first of all, convergence and the progressive blurring of boundaries between television, the delivery of content over various platforms like internet, IPTV, mobile TV, etc. A second phenomenon is, John referred to it in the presentation, the adoption at the European level of the Audiovisual Media Services Directive, which extends the scope of broadcasting regulation to audiovisual media services, which include those delivered over the internet. And there the challenge is to define what audiovisual media services is. Last, and not least, in fact, I think this is the most important factor of pressure, is what we can describe as rising social alarm. As internet usage increases, particularly amongst children and young users, politicians, the media, the yellow press a lot in the UK, and a number of sectors in society have become more concerned about the availability of illegal and harmful material online, such as abusive images of children, sexual violence, material which encourages racial hate, or material depicting illegal activity and dangerous activities such as fighting or gang membership. This has resulted in calls that something must be done. Nobody really knows yet what can be done. In the UK, to give just one example, the Prime Minister Gordon Brown asked in October last year Dr. Tanya Byron, who's a clinical psychologist and somehow of a TV star, to carry out a review, which was called the Byron Review, of the potential or actual risks of exposure of children and young people to potentially harmful or inappropriate material on the internet. And Ofcom contributed to this review substantially, I have to say, with a very detailed response that you can find on the web in case you're interested. So in this context which I have described, what I thought I would do in the remainder of this talk was to explore three main questions. The first one is, when traditional content regulators propose to intervene with respect to content delivered on the internet, what type of content are we really talking about? How are we proposing to regulate it? And an even more fundamental question, which is, why? What's the rationale for regulation in the first place? The second question, or the second thought that I would like to share with you is some of the thinking behind Ofcom's response to the Byron Review, because I think those are quite illustrative of how Ofcom think some of the challenges that society faces nowadays can be addressed, even if, as I say, we don't have any particular direct duty yet over content on the internet. And finally, to conclude, I will reflect a little bit on the changing nature of regulation in the communications sector as a whole. I will not talk so much about telecoms or functional separation or geographic market segmentation, unless you really, really, really want me to. But I will talk a little bit about the need to reconsider or perhaps redefine the role of regulatory authorities in this new environment. So, the first question, what should we regulate and why? This question has been raised continuously, and particularly as the internet continues to develop as a platform over which people watch audiovisual material, a platform which appears to fulfill functions which are similar to television, and most importantly, a platform that to some extent competes with it. And this is important because it explains the forces that have driven the extension of the scope of the directive, for example, which have names and addresses like France, like broadcasters in particular. This question has also been subject, as I said, to a major debate at the EU level. The directive was adopted at the end of 2007, and at the moment, governments and regulators around Europe are scratching their heads, and so are we, though we did significantly help to draft the final text. But we're scratching our heads as we begin to think about implementation at the national level. As you all know, and I don't think I need to remind you very much, but historically the case for regulation of television over and above other media or forms of artistic expression has rested on two grounds. First was spectrum scarcity, which justified public intervention to regulate the airwaves and avoid interference. And second, television was regarded as a very powerful medium with privileged access to mass audiences and a significant impact on society, and therefore a significant capacity to influence democratic processes and the democratic debate. And the question that we should ask before we do anything about the internet really is, can or should these arguments be transposed to the new convergent environment? Scarcity is gone. It's easy to access markets and distribute content nowadays. You don't only do it through the airwaves, but also there scarcity is decreasing. But in terms of the impact and reach of new technologies, I think that question hasn't really been answered. It's an open and highly controversial question, and I don't claim to have the answer to, but I want to caution against what seems to be the prevailing logic nowadays, which is, as television moves to other platforms, television regulation should follow. This is appealing, but it's dangerous, and it's very simplistic, because as you all know, the reality is always much more complex. Television is not just moving to other platforms, but it is also changing along the way, and it's converging with other media. I don't deny that there is a need to ensure that citizens and minors are protected against what could be harmful and offensive material, but I would seriously question, and so does Ofcom, so this we share, me and my institution, the idea that a model which, except for an occasional updating here and there, has in its essentials been around for somewhere over 20 to 40 years. The idea that that continues to be appropriate is wrong. Many of the new convergent services and many of the new convergent audiovisual services are characterized by entirely new models of content production, distribution, and the focus is increasingly on the creative role of the user or private individual in generating, editing, sharing with others their own original content. It can be argued that except for a minimum set of audiovisual services which are identical to television broadcasting, but delivered using IP technology, most of what it is currently available on internet platforms, despite the potentially global audience and the fact that it is indeed video, is consumed and perceived, and the perception is a very important aspect, very differently by users, and in a way which reminds us more of the press than the television medium. And I think this consideration, at the very minimum, challenges the assumption that new internet services need to be subject to the highly strict regulatory controls traditionally imposed on television broadcasts. That model is not only inappropriate, but it looks increasingly dated, and will need, sooner or later, inevitably have to be fundamentally rethought. And although this might seem to you, when you hear it, sensible and logic, most of the member states across Europe, when they're looking at the implementation of the Audiovisual Media Services Directive, I don't think they, and having discussed with some of the regulators in those countries, I don't think they really consider how they're going to extend the scope to these new services. They are simply and almost automatically give the regulator the responsibility over video on demand, including over the internet, without understanding whether this covers YouTube or not. Well, YouTube in this case not, because it's based, fortunately for them, in California, but the equivalent video-generated sharing sites like Dailymotion, who are based in France. Also, and quite important as well, it goes without saying that any intervention in this sector constitutes a restriction of the fundamental right of freedom of expression and should therefore be carried out with extreme care. And this as well seems very obvious, but having been witness of the European debates about this, the regulation of content over the internet, freedom of expression was not something that anybody really mentioned at any point, except for a random academic in Budapest, whom I know very well, Peter Molnar, who put together the Budapest Declaration with a number of other friends of his, and actually that declaration made it to the European Parliament. And I was significantly impressed because I encouraged him to do so, but in my pessimistic mood, with no expectation whatsoever that nobody would ever hear about it, and the Commission did take it as an example of stakeholder input to the debate. So that's the why. To go kind of into the detail of then what? What is it that regulators such as Ofcom will regulate? And mind you that we have to do this within less than a year and a half, so this is not just a theoretical question. Governments will have to legislate and define what they plan to regulate. The European Directive does not suggest that the Internet as such should be regulated. It only says that certain types of services should be. And there was a lot of debate, quite heated, about what these services should be. In the end, and I will spare you the debate, agreement on a compromise was reached that there was a reasonable case for a limited extension of regulation to those services like video on demand, which look and feel like a development of traditional TV, what in the jargon became described as TV-like services. Nobody knows what television is, so what is like television is more difficult to know, but that was the result. And the only difference in those video on demand services is that they are pulled as opposed to pushed to the viewer. And the argument behind it is that these services, because they look and feel like television, they create an expectation on the side of the user or the viewer that they will be regulated and that you will be protected when accessing them because they evoke or remind you of a context, which is a television context, in which you understand or expect not to watch a particular content without pin protection or a particular content at 10 in the morning. That was the idea. That takes you a little bit somewhere, but not that far, I have to confess. Generally, these video-on-demand services are services which are boundaried or closed, often offered by telecommunications operators such as Telefonica or BT or France Telecom or other IPTV providers. And there is a platform operator that has some oversight or control over the content that it's offered. For example, through the EPG, the Electronic Program Guide, which are the means through which users access the content. And on these platforms, the idea is that those platform operators can control the content and therefore should be responsible for ensuring that users have the tools and the information to protect themselves. And that is relatively easy to do, one could argue, in a closed network environment like IPTV or cable or satellite, where you have a subscription or you pay directly one of the operators for the content that gets to you. And most importantly, that entity, the cable provider or the telephone or the video-on-demand provider is in your jurisdiction, so you have someone to attach a regulation to. But that doesn't really answer the question of what happens to those services which are delivered over the open internet, where you don't really have a subscription, just go online and access them. And that's still a relatively open question, but as far as that subset, a small category of video-on-demand services delivered by telephony companies primarily, the end result was that, okay, let's apply some regulation to those. And at least in the UK, these are the sort of services that Ofcom and the UK government plan to capture in the new legislation. How you will regulate those, or what sort of enforcement mechanisms you envisage. The directive clearly sets a direction towards self and co-regulation as the principal means of implementation. And you will not be surprised to hear, if you know a little bit about the UK approach to regulation, that this is also the approach favored in the UK. Establishing a healthy and effective system of self and co-regulation is not a trivial task. And there is a separate session this afternoon after lunch which is dedicated to this issue, so I won't intrude into that debate, but I hope that we can have a bit of a discussion about how best to design what an effective self and co-regulatory scheme can look like. But just one final consideration to bring the little bit about the European Directive back into the internet debate. Despite the efforts of the European Commission and despite the current efforts and goodwill of a number of governments across Europe, it will be a mistake to think that the new directive will make the internet safe. Rather, it will result in an internet where there are some video services which are regulated and which audiences can approach with some degree of confidence, the same way they approach traditional broadcast television. But let me be very clear about this. The internet content market and the internet audiovisual content market is and will remain a global one, with no central control of the services offered and no single point for consumer protection enforcement. So for audiences, and it should be the same for public authorities, the AVMS is only part of the picture. Statutory regulation could never deliver on a promise of consumer protection because a national regulator cannot manage this global content market, particularly because there is no one single institution across the internet value chain that you can attach regulation to and be confident that it will work. There is no equivalent of a channel, the sort of entity that we currently license, and to which we attach all the obligations, regardless of whether they produce the content or commission it to third parties. But that's not the case in the internet environment. And there will be no platform operator or equivalent, except in these closed networks which I have just described, that can be in control of the content, the search, the navigation tools that audiences use to find what they want. And this leads me to the second issue that I wanted to discuss today, which is, well, what do we do with the rest? And how can we ensure that audiences, and particularly minors, remain protected while they're consuming material online? Because a lot of this, particularly the social alarm point which I raised, has to do with children. And that's a legitimate concern. The reason why politicians become excited and concerned, and the reason why the media and the press raise some of the social alarm is because there is a genuine societal concern about protecting children from harmful material. And we looked carefully at this question in preparing the response to the Byron review to which I referred earlier. And we did a lot of research. Ofcom does an incredible amount of research. It's really well funded, and that's why they can afford the research. And it showed some interesting trends. Clearly, no surprise, the internet is much used and valued by children, young people and adults alike, and the importance to the child increases with age. Overall, 99% of children between the ages of 8 and 17 say they access the internet. 81% of these do it at home and 86% do it at school, with 18% only having access outside the home. 80% of parents have internet access at home, compared with 57% of adults without children. And there is a mixed picture regarding the effectiveness of parental oversight of the internet use at home. So unsurprisingly, almost half of the parents believe that their children are more skilled than they are. And generally, and particularly for older children, use is unsupervised. So only 28% of 12 to 15-year-olds were supervised. This is probably the result of 16% or so of children having a PC with an internet connection in their own bedroom. While 1 in 7 of the 8 to 17-year-olds say they have come across harmful material, only 1 in 10 parents knew. And the most frequently material was, again, not surprisingly, sexual content followed by violence. And the likelihood of coming across such material increases with age, and so does the likelihood of not telling your parents. The majority of parents, 57%, do not know where to go to get information about how to protect their children online. And finally, although parents and children have concerns about the internet, both thought that the benefits outweigh the risks. And I find this last fact particularly encouraging, because it confirms that public authorities should continue to focus their efforts on ensuring wide availability and access to the internet, which is no evil, while minimizing the risks of harm associated with its use. And I should also say that the evidence of actual harm occurring as opposed to risk was very difficult to find. It was patchy and it was inconclusive. And this also reminds us of the very important need to get the balance of freedom and protection right. In the response to the Byron Review, Ofcom considered whether there was any need for a statutory regulation. We have to as one of the options. And we concluded that currently, not only legal constraints at the EU level, that is the Electronic Commerce Directive, but also the intrinsic nature of the Internet and the problems with jurisdictional reach made statutory regulation impractical. So our conclusion of the need for statutory regulation was not dissimilar to the conclusions reached by the UK Parliament in 2003. Furthermore, even without the legal constraints, the impact of direct regulation would be of very limited effectiveness. So instead, what Ofcom submitted as a new approach to content regulation was a model which they called of distributed responsibility across the value chain, which relies on a combination of industry and consumer responsibility, and where each participant along the value chain, including the user at the end of it, has a role to play. So in this model, content producers and aggregators can label the content and provide, for example, age verification tools. Hosts of user-generated content such as YouTube or MySpace or the evil Facebook can and have developed community standards to define the types of content that they will make available and how they will deal with complaints. And I have to say that on this point there is some scope for improvement. The operation and the timescales of the notice and takedown procedures tend to be quite sophisticated but fairly opaque to the user. So if you complain about a video that you don't like on YouTube or that you think was highly violent, as a user you don't really know who will look at it, how long will it take, what were the criteria that the site used to take it down. So you can definitely improve that self-regulation within those sites. Search engines also and navigation tools can provide some ways of protecting audiences, for example, through what's called safe search. And in addition, web hosts and ISPs work with self-regulatory institutions to take down illegal content and to block sites which host illegal content but that are outside of their jurisdiction. There's also the possibility, as you know, of supporting the user by offering them filtering software, which they could run on their PCs. And there is some scope for improvement there because obviously filters end up overblocking or underblocking, but they don't tend to work very well. However, well, and just to finish on that point, for all of that to actually work, it is important that users have the ability to understand how these tools work, how these filters work. And also, that's why media literacy, what I referred earlier as alfabetización digital, has become such a fundamental aspect of the regulatory ecology. But let me stress that this is nothing new, in the sense that media literacy is nothing new, and content regulators, traditional content regulators, like Ofcom and the CAC, today rely on audiences literacy in the context of broadcasting regulation. So they count, for example, on the watershed, or they count on the audience's ability to respond to air warnings, and to audience's ability to identify through the brand of the channel what sort of content they will receive. So if they see a program called Dance X in the BBC, they don't expect quite the similar content if they're watching a program called Dance X in the Playboy channel. And that is media literacy. And it took about 30 years for audiences to understand what the watershed was and the fact that after a certain time of the day, content was likely to be of a relatively more adult nature. And that sort of understanding is what we call media literacy, or one aspect of what can be described as media literacy. So under this model of distributed responsibility, everyone has a role to play, but no one is uniquely in the position to promise safety. And it is only such combination of actions and tools that can help restrict accessibility to harmful content and protect audiences on the internet, and especially minors. But most importantly, that model will not compromise the fundamental freedom to use, to create, and to innovate on the internet. In summary, We all know that the new media world is inherently more complex and fast-moving than traditional broadcasting. So it should follow naturally that the policy response to problematic content should be as dynamic and flexible. Now, asking a regulator, even if it's Ofcom, which has about 800 people, to be dynamic and flexible is difficult. Ofcom has a motto, is a little bit corporate, so we have in the walls of the offices the motto to be the most creative, responsive, and effective regulator in the world, and that's supposed to permeate in the minds of the people working there. But I think still, regulators can never be expected to be sufficiently dynamic. I have argued today that any attempts of extending the model of traditional broadcasting regulation, which attaches responsibility to one single entity, like the channel, to the new media, where responsibility, as I've said, is shared, are bound to fail. And this brings me to my final reflection of the day, which is the nature of regulation in the new media environment and the need for regulators to redefine themselves and their role. In this new context, any attempt by the regulator to micromanage distribution and consumption of media, like the advertising minutes that I referred to in the beginning, in a way which is characteristic of traditional television regulation, will be like Don Quixote fighting against the windmills, to take a homegrown but universal metaphor. In this context as well, it is to some extent unsurprising that self and co-regulation have become central in contributing to the maintenance of a necessary degree of consumer protection. And one can also observe a similar development in the telecommunications sector in relation to new services. Regulators and policymakers are starting to realize that they need to engage with industry and with consumers, not only to understand the changes in the market or in social behavior, but also to respond to them in the most appropriate and efficient manner. There might be some cynics amongst you who could argue that such a regulatory withdrawal is less a well-considered, after a long period of reflection, retreat by the regulator, as more a cry for help in the form of an invitation to other parties to join the regulatory dialogue, because regulators simply feel helpless in the light of the political pressures that they are facing. In this game, the regulator's role is no longer confined to the setting out of rules or the monitoring of market behavior, but it also involves taking a more active role at orchestrating the engagement with industry and consumers. Something that we could call a multi-party regulation, representing a new mode of regulatory governance, which is inevitable, and which might indeed prove superior, I think, in the context of rapid developments. Critically, this partnership could be seen as the only way to address the intrinsically global nature of Internet services. And it is a regulation that is collaborative in its taste, with, as I said, the role of the regulator being fundamentally different in nature. Undoubtedly, this puts increased pressure on the need for greater transparency, representation and accountability in regulatory activity to ensure legitimacy and to avoid what is called regulatory capture. A task that requires involvement of us all in our capacity as regulators, policymakers, and most of all, as citizens. Thank you very much for your attention.
Bé, moltes gràcies per aquesta, diguem-ne, visió, diguem-ne, comprimida de tota una problemàtica bastant complexa i, com es diu en el món acadèmic, sobretot anglosaxó, el més important no és donar les respostes, totes les respostes, sinó posar correctament les preguntes. Jo crec que has articulat un discurs sobre la base, sobretot crec, d'articular correctament les preguntes. Bé, jo crec que el que és clar és que la convergència no és només un fenomen tecnològic. Diguem-ne, els nous sistemes, la nova manera de tenir accés a la informació que ens proporciona la convergència no és només un fenomen tecnològic, afecta la forma com la informació circula, la forma com els individus ens relacionem amb els altres, la forma com es conformen els imaginaris i les actituds, la dimensió i l'abast de la plaça pública, la condició de participació dels ciutadans en el sistema democràtic i també l'abast de l'exercici del poder econòmic i la dimensió política que pot arribar a tenir, ja que ens posem en clau marxista un altre cop, l'exercici d'aquest poder econòmic a escala global, com a forma de poder polític situat en mans privades. I és per aquests motius pels quals, diguem-ne, els juristes ens preocupem per la convergència i ens preocupem per aquestes qüestions i tenim aquest tipus de discussions. La qüestió que estàvem discutint aquí, segurament a Espanya ens agafa, diguem-ne, bastant enrere, perquè la discussió que tu plantejaves, que és la que s'ha de plantejar, és fins a quin punt la regulació de la ràdio i la televisió ha d'arribar més enllà de la ràdio i la televisió, i en el cas d'Espanya no tenim regulació de la ràdio i la televisió. Per tant, diguem-ne, podríem considerar, o bé que ens hem saltat el pas previ, és a dir, no tenim encara autoritat reguladora dels continguts audiovisuals. Per tant, i en aquests moments a Espanya hi ha una discussió sobre si la nova autoritat que es crea convergirà amb la Comissió del Mercado de les Telecomunicaciones o bé serà una autoritat nova. I el que hi ha darrere d'aquesta discussió són motius de tot tipus, menys motius, diguem-ne, racionals o qüestions de debat sobre si és més convenient regular de forma convergent o no, sinó motius d'altra naturalesa. Per tant, diguem-ne, jo em sap greu també, però hem de ser conscients també aquí a Espanya del moment del debat al qual ens trobem. Jo he de recordar que la Comissió Europea té obert un procediment contra Espanya per incompliment de la directiva, de l'antiga directiva de televisió sense fronteres, perquè no controla adequadament els temps de publicitat, els límits de temps de publicitat. Entre altres coses perquè no hi ha autoritat de regulació a nivell estatal. És a dir, torno a repetir encara que sembla que tiri cap a casa. Per tant, diguem-ne, la realitat espanyola és... I si ho mirem fins i tot en clau catalana, la cosa encara és més complicada, perquè a Catalunya no podríem ser mai convergents en la mesura en què telecomunicacions és una competència exclusiva de l'Estat, que mai podria tenir-la una autoritat catalana. La qual cosa, diguem-ne, la translació en clau catalana, en clau local de tot el debat el fa encara més complicat. No només algunes reflexions, perquè la meva idea no és fer una contraponència, sinó estimular, si voleu, una mica el debat. L'escassez radioelèctrica com a justificació per a la regulació ha desaparegut, certament, però jo crec que fins i tot en els seus orígens jo crec que el poder públic va aprofitar l'escassetat de l'espectre radioelèctric per fer-lo encara més escàs i justificar una intervenció, perquè jo crec que la justificació de la regulació dels continguts audiovisuals des del final de la Segona Guerra Mundial i a la vista, diguem-ne, de la força que va tenir la propaganda a la Segona Guerra Mundial és el tema de la influència dels mitjans de comunicació en la societat, en la configuració d'una societat democràtica, vegis, doncs, diguem-ne, la capacitat d'un mitjà de comunicació per fer la guerra de dos mundos, diguem-ne. Aquí hi ha el debat. En el debat es barregen dues coses, és a dir, la crisi del television-like, per entendre'ns, i aleshores aquí a vegades barregem la persistència o no de motius que justifiquen la regulació amb la persistència o no de la capacitat per regular i per aplicar la regulació. És a dir, que a vegades sembla que una cosa vagi lligada amb l'altra. I és veritat, com diu el professor conegut nostre, que es diu Elinoam, que el criteri regulatori més habitual o diguem-ne més possible és el criteri de l'última milla. Tu només pots regular si realment de manera proporcionada i eficient pots tenir accés a l'última milla. I la qüestió, en matèria d'espectre radioelèctric, en matèria de cable, etc., tu podies tenir accés a l'última milla i això et permetia, diguem-ne, regular moltes qüestions que no tenien res a veure amb l'ús de l'espectre ni amb l'ús del domini públic per construir xarxes de cable. La qüestió és si amb la convergència tecnològica tu pots regular l'última milla o segurament la pregunta més ben posada seria: és proporcionat regular l'última milla? És a dir, és proporcionat fer pesar sobre aquells qui tenen la responsabilitat de fer arribar fins als consumidors els continguts tota una sèrie de càrregues regulatòries, diguem-ne, i fer-les recaure només sobre ells. Jo crec que aquest, diguem-ne, és una mica la qüestió, perquè la causa per la regulació jo crec que continua. La qüestió també és a qui regulem, és a dir, a qui fem responsable i quin poder té aquell a qui regulem. És evident que no estem regulant a qui està penjant un vídeo a YouTube, però jo el que em pregunto és quin poder tindrà les institucions públiques per concertar-se amb YouTube perquè YouTube assumeixi responsabilitats a l'hora de regular continguts. Perquè clar, nosaltres a vegades ens escandalitzem, diguem-ne, perquè un jutge, o no diguem ja una autoritat de regulació, retira un contingut o sanciona per la difusió d'un contingut, però YouTube, diguem-ne, penja i despenja continguts que considera inapropiats sobre la base de procediments que, per dir-ho així, no tenen cap mena de procediment, ni garantia, ni transparència. És a dir, que en aquests moments ens trobem que a l'esfera pública, de manera progressiva, i aquí, diguem-ne, dono per reproduït una mica el discurs traslladat a l'àmbit audiovisual que ens ha fet abans el professor aquí, en el qual, diguem-ne, jo he de dir que m'ha avançat per l'esquerra, perquè totes les reflexions que jo anava a fer sobre el poder dels gatekeepers que en aquests moments tenim a l'hora de distribuir continguts audiovisuals a la xarxa, doncs és un problema realment important. I la meva pregunta és fins a quin punt, diguem-ne, des del poder públic, tenint en compte que el poder públic és la instància, en principi, democràticament legitimada per regular, tindrà capacitat d'interlocució amb aquests gatekeepers, amb aquests colls d'ampolla, diguem-ne, que d'ara en endavant, o que sembla que tenen la tendència a ser ells els qui decidiran a través d'internet com circulen els continguts audiovisuals i, en definitiva, com es configura també el nostre imaginari col·lectiu, com es recondueixen els debats democràtics, etc. Aquestes eren una mica les reflexions que volia fer. Sobretot, insisteixo, és a dir, fins a quin punt els nous models de regulació als quals tendim garanteixen efectivament, diguem-ne, la vigència del principi democràtic i eviten, diguem-ne, determinades formes d'arbitrarietat que podrien situar-se més en mans privades que en mans públiques. Tampoc no són preguntes que adreço directament, sinó simplement per obrir el debat i perquè puguem discutir amb nosaltres. Una precisió última, si em deixes, alfabetització digital és la manera com els espanyols que viuen al Regne Unit anomenen la media literacy. Aquí la media literacy l'anomenem media literacy. Però perquè a nosaltres ens agrada a més dir-ho d'aquesta manera. Però això només utilitzo, diguem-ne, entre els espanyols que viveu al Regne Unit. Quan vinguis aquí ja pots utilitzar tranquil·lament el concepte media literacy. Bé, no sé si hi ha qüestions, però jo crec que val la pena obrir-la.
Felicitats per la ponència, molt interessant. Tinc dues qüestions. La primera es, ¿entiendes bien el catalán o cambio?
Sí, perfectamente.
Da igual,
sí. No, perfectamente, lo entiendo.
La primera és fins a quin punt la demanda de regulació no respon a una il·lusió necessària, diguéssim, en termes de Chomsky, no? Donar la sensació de seguretat donarà seguretat? És a dir, per exemple, la pornografia no seguirà existint? Per exemple, aquí a Espanya són molt famosos els vídeos que pengen a YouTube en els quals s'apallissa una persona gran o una persona deficient, etc. Això no desapareixerà, no es deixarà de fer pel fet que la gent no ho vegi. Aquesta primera qüestió. De fet, d'aquí surt la sortida cap a la corregulació. Abans de sancionar els continguts que es poden considerar antisocials, etc., es surt cap a la corregulació. El que passa és que jo crec que segueix treballant amb els esquemes antics. Per exemple, la corregulació, tal com la defineix la Directiva de mitjans audiovisuals, diu ha d'introduir un mecanisme de garantia, és a dir, ha d'introduir un controlador, que només podrà controlar els que s'han sotmès a la corregulació. Però vull dir, no es podia pensar en una regulació col·laborativa fins i tot a l'hora de dur a terme el control o diguem-li com vulguem, per donar a la gent la possibilitat d'autocontrolar-se i de controlar-se d'una forma col·lectiva. Això primera pregunta. I després segona pregunta. Jo per mi la definició que ha fet la Directiva de Serveis de Mitjans Audiovisuals és molt bona, la definició dels serveis i tal, i exclou en bona mesura el que és l'internet no professional, l'internet ciutadà, aquell que està protegit per la llibertat d'expressió, etc. La qual cosa no vol dir que no s'exerceixi control, perquè avui dia la policia intervé molt, per exemple, en els continguts de YouTube, etc. Però és un control, diguéssim, residual, per allò que és realment greu. Però per mi el problema no és aquest, el problema és que la convergència fa que hi hagi un espai molt movadís entre el que és l'àmbit de la llei de la societat d'informació, la directiva i en el nostre cas la llei, i el que és la llei de l'audiovisual. De tal manera que hi ha diferents mecanismes i diferents nivells de protecció i, per exemple, l'internet no professional jo crec que no està tan ben protegit en matèria de serveis de societat d'informació, que segurament és una molt bona part dels continguts audiovisuals, no està tan ben protegit com a la directiva de mitjans audiovisuals. Aquesta és la meva sensació i això pot donar lloc a uns diferents nivells d'intervenció i de control que no són idonis per lo que és internet en la seva globalitat.
Gràcies. Sí, una cosa que jo crec que algun cop hem comentat fins i tot nosaltres, que és que jo crec que el procés d'elaboració de la directiva, de la reforma de la directiva audiovisual sense fronteres, és un procés llarg i és també la dimensió d'aquest procés el que acaba condicionant. És a dir, jo crec que en el moment en què es fa la primera proposta, YouTube no existia. És a dir, com a concepte, com a model, YouTube no existia. I llavors YouTube de cop i volta apareix enmig del procés.
El mismo dia que se publicó.
I llavors, a partir d'aquí, diguem-ne, també acaba condicionant també el debat i acaba condicionant aleshores que es busqui una solució de la qual, diguem-ne, la Mònica no ho ha dit, però jo crec que Ofcom n'és en bona mesura responsable de la manera com es pondera, diguem-ne, la qüestió dins de la directiva, però és que teníem un punt de partida, que era un punt de partida, diguem-ne, que anava molt més enllà en termes regulatoris, però que també, diguem-ne, era bastant més, es plantejava en un món molt més abstracte del que després va acabar resultant essent, diguem-ne. Si no, vols respondre ara? Esperem...
Sí, no, quizás respondo un poco a las dos preguntas que tú planteabas. Lo primero es que has dicho si la regulación no responde a una ilusión de dar seguridad o a la necesidad de dar seguridad al ciudadano. Y seguramente sí, es la respuesta, pero eso es además el peligro. O el gran problema es prometer a los ciudadanos una protección que es inexistente. Porque lo que consigues, si ese es el mensaje de la autoridad pública, es que el ciudadano diga, estoy protegido. Y no sea responsable o no tenga una mayor responsabilidad por el consumo de medios o de contenidos a través de Internet, ¿no? Esa es un poco la primera pregunta. Y estoy de acuerdo contigo en que mucho de ello es el resultado de vídeos en YouTube de bandas o de menores pegándose unos a otros, ¿no? Pero si eso es lo que aparece en YouTube, tú no tienes un problema de un vídeo, tienes un problema social, que es distinto, ¿no? Y eso es otra cosa que a la hora de... Porque regules o porque quites el vídeo no dejan de pasar tales incidentes. A la hora... La última cuestión que has mencionado es esa idea de que va a ser continuamente, creo, imposible marcar un punto en el espectro de contenidos audiovisuales que están en Internet sobre qué está regulado y qué no está regulado. Lo que hace la directiva es tratar de decir, bueno, este es el espacio en Internet donde hay contenido visual, vamos a regular este poquito. Y el resto, pues la ley general, el código penal se aplica, ¿no? Lo que pasa es que cada vez más hay servicios que son semiprofesionales en los que es difícil, que podrían a lo mejor cumplir los requisitos que se establecen en la directiva, porque son programas, hay un cierto control editorial, aunque sea semiprofesional, son actividades económicas, porque suele haber bastante publicidad, son servicios de medios de comunicación masiva, porque están en Internet y porque tienen una especie de objetivo de entretener y de informar. Y entonces el gran problema, y por eso mi presentación, no es tanto, tenemos un problema si lo regula YouTube. No, es que YouTube puede hacer lo que quiera. YouTube o cualquier otra página está sujeta a la ley general, y lo que es ilegal offline es ilegal online. No hay que regular. De lo que se trata es, bueno, de asegurar que los menores están protegidos. Si hay un debate más o menos democrático, yo no sé si YouTube está capacitado para tomar decisiones, pero tampoco creo que quizá los reguladores o las autoridades públicas sean quienes tienen que decidir qué tipo de contenidos aparecen. Eso que lo decida cada uno como quiera, ¿no? Dentro de los límites de lo que es jurídicamente permisible. De lo único de lo que nos tenemos que preocupar, en mi opinión, es de que los menores estén protegidos, y ese es un problema no de contenidos ilegales, sino de contenidos dañinos. Es decir, contenidos que para cualquiera de nosotros son completamente permisibles, pero que a un menor le pueden hacer daño. Porque en ese caso, como el regulador no tiene control del contexto en el que ese contenido se pone a disposición del espectador, como lo teníamos en el mundo tradicional de la televisión, en el que uno tiene un control del horario de audiencia o del canal, los desafíos son mucho mayores. Y estoy de acuerdo contigo en que la autorregulación y la corregulación para esas cuestiones particulares es la única respuesta posible en este momento. Pero el motivo principal o el desafío, yo creo, para las autoridades públicas es dejar a la ciudadanía muy claro que son ellos los que tienen que ser responsables de su propio consumo. Y no venderles una falsa promesa, una falsa ilusión de protección, porque entonces lo único que conseguiremos es que los padres no se ocupen de lo que ven sus hijos. Puesto simplemente.
Sí.
Federal Communications Commission were thinking as sophisticatedly as this presentation suggests Ofcom is. Nonetheless, I'd make two brief comments. I think it's technologically approximately the worst possible time to be thinking about these questions. The difficulty is that responsiveness at present seems to be limited to imagining that there is television and there is YouTube. What's actually happening in the world is that US patent law is having a peculiar conservative effect on what we understand to be video services, because an enormous thicket of patent law, not only US patent law, but mostly US patent law, makes it impossible, or has made it impossible, to treat video as a first-class object in the web. It hasn't been possible just to say, look, video is like pictures in the web. You just say image, close tag, put whatever you want, right, and go on with your page. That's about to change. I'm working with the W3C to try and find a way to cut through that patent thicket for HTML5. We'll do it. Video will just be another object in the web, and web pages will be able to use video with the same inherent flexibility that they use text and pictures. And video in the net will cease to be characterized by television broadcasters on the one hand and a bulletin board you can pin copies of film clips to, right? And all of the other applications which can be made of video in the web, so that editing is an entirely decentralized activity, so that mashups between video and other kinds of data in the web are natural and simple to make. All of that will suddenly flood the system, and judgments made on the basis of distinctions that have to do with the current environment will become obsolete immediately. The Beeb, I notice, is aware of this and can't figure out which side it's on, and the Beeb is only in that respect like other kinds of broadcasters. One might try and make a distinction not between pull and push, but between streaming and downloading. The UK would probably be the worst place on earth to do that, because what information we have about BitTorrent and television suggests that UK citizens are more engaged in sharing television programs through BitTorrent than any other population in the world. I kind of like the idea, though I suspect your colleagues wouldn't, that you define television as anything which consists of video subject to exclusive ownership rights under copyright law, and not television as everything under Creative Commons and other free sharing licenses. If you did that, you would have an immediate effect on the world which would be highly desirable. All the regulated activities would belong to the people using advertising to control the brain. All the unregulated activities would belong to people engaged in free sharing, and you'd strike a blow for the revolution. But we know it isn't going to happen, because the Beeb isn't even able to share its back catalog, let alone everything else. Note that that would be a perfectly acceptable position for Ofcom to take. If you're not engaged in sharing the video you used to have freely with the world, you're going to be highly regulated with respect to what you can do in future. The real heart, it seems to me, of the problem is this belief that media should be safe. This is ludicrous, right? It's like declaring that art should be safe. It's not only an inappropriate social goal, it's a reprehensible social goal. It arises from the belief that the appropriate use of the coercive power of the state should be over those people who create things because somebody might be offended that it's done in front of their children. It's totally unacceptable, and anything that emerges from Brussels that has that interpretation should be interpreted in some other way in order to prevent a negative interaction with the principles of human rights. Local, national implementation should therefore take for granted that nobody is attempting to render media safe, and politicians who want to have safe media should be essentially like politicians who want to have safe art. They should be relegated to a corner of the Tory universe, and if Mr. Cameron wants to run for election on those grounds, he should be let to do so. In general, it seems to me that's the real point. In whose interest do regulators regulate? If the principles upon which they regulate are those essentially retrogressive anti-artistic principles that everything should be safe before 6 p.m., they function as though the church had been put back in substantial charge of government activity. It may not be that particular church, but it's some church or other, and it shouldn't be let to do so. I know that the idea that the purpose of regulators is to put regulators out of business is always unpopular, but it represents, in light of technological reality, a feasible and highly justifiable position, and it's one that ought at least to have a spokesperson inside every regulatory entity. I would encourage you to be that spokesperson.
Just a quick couple of comments. I like to see that sort of campaigning constantly. I agree with a lot of what you say, but I have a question back, which is, you started with the premise that video on the web will be just the same object as anything else. That's a technological reality. It's good, it's fine, but that doesn't address perhaps the fundamental question, which is, does video have a different impact than text? And is that why we regulate? And I would submit that that used to be the case, and that's why television was regulated in particular, because the impact and the influence and the pervasiveness of video and moving images seem to cause on citizens a particular sort of excitement. But I believe that that would be less and less the case, because now, if your site doesn't have video, then it's not a good site to go to, frankly. And video has just become part of the media environment, but not something that's special. The question is, from that perspective, and I think as you raised well, what's the impact and what's the reach? When it comes to artistic expression, you know, I guess the difference might be that if you want to see particularly challenging or provoking pieces of art, you go to the Tate. You don't have to pay an entrance fee unless it's a specific exhibition, but you go there and you can decide who you take with. When you go online, everything is available, and there is, I assume in the minds of a lot of people, less control over what happens. But it raises an interesting question, because the debate at the moment, for example, in the UK relating to public service broadcasting and its future, It's moving from, it's not a debate about whether public service broadcasters like the BBC should be online. Yes, they should. The question is how to fund it, how to structure it. And there's a move from the concept of public service broadcasting to public service content. And that is not just content provided by the broadcasters, it would also be content, or that's one of the sort of definitions or approaches, content provided by museums, public institutions, public libraries, the Tate itself. The Tate has a fantastic website with video, and there is no reason why they should not have a video exhibition, which would be content, which you would clearly describe as public service, and many of us would. But perhaps, as you say, it's provocative. It has some nudity on it, which would not be acceptable on a BBC program, which is also public service. And so I think you've raised a very good question when it comes to, which brings, I think, the debate back to freedom of expression and artistic expression in that respect. And I don't think that, at least in the UK, they have found an answer to that. But I'll be your spokesperson.
Gràcies. No, hi havia una qüestió al fil de les discussions que ara aquí teníem. Quan jo parlava del poder de YouTube, no parlava tant, o del poder regulatori de YouTube, no parlava tant sobre la seva capacitat d'aplicar o no determinats límits, sinó sobre un canvi que jo crec que és molt important, que és que fins ara, diguem-ne, les autoritats nacionals de regulació teníem un paper molt important en relació amb una determinada noció de pluralisme. Nosaltres definíem el que enteníem que era una esfera pública plural i definíem que en una esfera pública plural havia d'haver-hi 8, 9, 10, X actors. I a més, uns actors que devien guardar entre ells unes determinades proporcions. A partir d'ara, si canviem diguem-ne, el paradigma, no és tant una qüestió de que eliminem la possibilitat de controlar continguts en termes de límits, sinó que eliminem d'alguna manera la capacitat pública de definir les característiques estructurals de l'esfera pública. I aquestes característiques estructurals de l'esfera pública vindran definides per un poder, diguem-ne, privat, o diguem-ne, o van siguent assumides per tota una sèrie, per això deia gatekeepers, diguem-ne, no? És a dir, fa temps es deia que el 80% del tràfic d'internet passa per un 5% de les portes que hi ha obertes a internet i la resta de les portes ningú hi entra perquè, entre altres coses, ni tan sols les coneixen. Llavors, aquesta era, diguem-ne, la meva principal preocupació, no tant una qüestió de si podem arribar a protegir la infantesa i la joventut, diguem-ne, o determinats valors, perquè jo crec que fins i tot la pròpia indústria pot tenir interès, sobretot la gran indústria, sinó fins a quin punt, diguem-ne, podem preservar una esfera pública democràtica, en un moment en què aquestes capacitats que tradicionalment tenia l'Estat, per allò que també un amic nostre, Monroe parla sovint de bubble, les bombolles nacionals, aquestes bombolles en les quals l'autoritat nacional tenia la capacitat de predeterminar com aquesta comunitat nacional s'imaginava a si mateixa, això es trenca i el poder de definir com la gent s'imagina a si mateixa diguem-ne, passa bastant a mans privades. I la qüestió no és tant que sigui una decisió, diguem-ne, podem pensar que no, és que, en fi, és que hem arribat a una democràcia deliberativa mundial, però la veritat és que no és així, perquè qui d'alguna manera fa de guàrdia de tràfic i decideix quins temes estan a l'esfera pública, quins no estan, quins discursos, quins no estan, d'alguna manera són aquests gatekeepers, diguem-ne, controlats, Facebook controlat per la CIA, etc. Per tant, la meva reflexió era més estructural que no pas de continguts. I tampoc no tinc la resposta, però aquest era el sentit una mica de la... I no sé si en aquests moments és realista parlar d'una esfera pública global, en aquests moments encara. Aquí segurament, i recullo una mica el que també estaves dient ara, hi ha lloc per plantejar-nos el nou paper del servei públic, és a dir, de l'Estat, no hi ha tant com a regulador i com a limitador, sinó com a difusor de continguts. És a dir, que l'Estat, el poder públic, pot promoure determinades plataformes per garantir un cert nivell de pluralisme a la xarxa, oferir altres possibilitats. Però no sé, per tant, diguem-ne, una actuació més prestacional que no pas policial, diguem-ne, en aquest sentit, però no ho sé, però volia fer aquesta reflexió sobretot en termes estructurals. No sé si hi ha alguna qüestió. Bé, si no hi ha més qüestions, jo simplement, jo volia insistir, diguem-ne, vull acabar insistint una mica en la nostra realitat. El primer trimestre del 2008 va ser el primer cop en què cap cadena de televisió a Espanya obtenia més del 20% del share. Per tant, del 20% de l'audiència. Per tant, vol dir que nosaltres encara, en moltes societats, vivim en unes societats que encara són molt televisives, diguem-ne, i que el consum encara és molt televisiu. A Espanya, d'altra banda, estem fent una transició cap a la televisió digital de, diguem-ne, resultat incert. És a dir, en aquests moments, diguem-ne, vivim en un país que encara és essencialment analògic, que consumeix bàsicament televisió, diguem-ne, en obert i en analògic, i que a més tenim un espectre radioelèctric que hem de gestionar correctament per passar-lo de l'analògic al digital i, entre altres coses, ho hem de netejar de pirates i de tota mena d'emissores que en aquests moments estan fent molt complicada la neteja de l'espectre i la transició cap al digital. No fa gaire va aparèixer un informe del professor Bustamante, que era la televisión digital terrestre en España por un sistema televisivo de futuro acorde con una democracia de calidad, que, resumit, diguem-ne, a totes les pàgines, és la de no llegaremos a tiempo, a la data de la transició. Per tant, diguem-ne que aquest debat, evidentment, és absolutament procedent i ho hem de tenir, i està bé que la UOC el tinguem i és el lloc on l'hem de tenir, però hem de ser conscients també de la realitat en la qual, o jo vull destacar, diguem-ne, la realitat en la qual ens trobem en aquests moments a Espanya i a Catalunya, que és una realitat encara d'una gran complexitat, on, per exemple, continua pendent no només la creació d'un Consell Audiovisual a nivell estatal, sinó fins i tot d'una llei general reguladora de la comunicació audiovisual a nivell de l'Estat. Que ens movem en la legislació dels anys 80 que diu que la televisió és un servicio público esencial reservado al Estado. Per tant, no vull tirar un gerro d'aigua freda, perquè realment la discussió, jo crec que la discussió que hem de tenir és aquesta i no com tanquem les il·legals, perquè aquesta és una qüestió que ja ens ocupa el regulador, però en tot cas siguem conscients també que en el nostre país tots aquests processos o tots aquests debats tenen lloc en un context d'una particular complexitat i d'una particular, segurament potser també, falta de maduresa. Algun altre comentari, alguna altra qüestió? Bé, falten 2 minuts per la una. La unió entre, diguem-ne, una britànica d'adopció i un català provoca una racionalitat i una puntualitat en els temps que, fins i tot aquests comentaris que faig no fan que el 58 passi al 59 per poder dir ara sí que són les 13, per tant acabarem un minut abans, lamento la falta de puntualitat.
Bé, reprendrem la sessió a 2:15. Ara en principi hi ha previst un petit refrigeri. No arriba a dinar potser, però diguem-ne un lunch, i crec que hem estat tan puntuals que no el tindran disponible fins d'aquí 10 minuts, però en qualsevol cas tenim una hora per comentar.